I found my daughter's body at the bottom of a ravine, but she wasn't dead. That's not how this story starts, but it's where it almost ended. 26 hours after my own family left us to die in the Colorado wilderness, after they stole our car and disappeared with a $2 million life insurance policy in their back pocket, I was rappelling down a cliff face with nothing but torn bed sheets and a mother's desperation to save the only person in the world who still mattered to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how my loving family tried to murder us for money, and how we turned the tables on them in ways they never saw coming. The morning it all began, I was standing in my kitchen in Denver, stirring Emma's oatmeal and scrolling through my phone, when the call came that would change everything. My stepfather Richard's voice was unusually warm, almost grandfatherly, which should have been my first warning sign. "Claire, I know things have been tense between us since your mother's passing," he said, his tone carefully measured. "But Emma is still my step-granddaughter, and with this inheritance business being finalized, I think it's time we put our differences aside." The inheritance. Mom had died 6 months ago, leaving me everything in her will: the house, her savings, and most importantly, her shares in the family construction business that Richard had been running for 15 years. Shares that would give me controlling interest and the power to push him out entirely. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, though every instinct screamed at me to hang up. "A family camping trip, just like when you were little. You, Emma, me, Aunt Sarah, and Uncle Tom. A chance to reconnect before you make any permanent decisions about the business." Emma, my 8-year-old daughter, who'd been grieving her grandmother's death for months, looked up hopefully at the word camping. She'd been asking to meet her step-grandfather's family, the relatives I'd been deliberately keeping her away from since Mom died. "Please, Mommy," she whispered, her eyes lighting up for the first time in weeks. "I want to see the mountains." Against my better judgment, against the voice in my head that reminded me why I'd cut contact with Richard's side of the family years ago, I said yes. 3 days later, I was loading our hiking gear into my Honda CR-V, watching Richard's pristine black Suburban pull into my driveway. Sarah and Tom emerged first, Richard's sister and brother-in-law, both carrying expensive camping equipment that looked like it had never been used. Then Richard himself, tall and distinguished at 62, with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that had charmed my mother into marriage and convinced her to sign over power of attorney before she got sick. "Claire!" Sarah embraced me with theatrical enthusiasm. "You look wonderful. And Emma, my goodness, you've grown so much since the funeral." Emma hung back shyly, but Tom crouched down to her level with a warm smile that seemed genuine. "I heard you like to draw," he said, pulling a small sketchbook from his jacket. "I thought you might want to capture some mountain views." For a moment I felt guilty about my suspicions. These were my mother's chosen family, people who'd sat beside her hospital bed and held her hand during her final days. Maybe I'd been unfair. Maybe grief had made me paranoid. The drive to the campsite took 4 hours, winding through mountain roads that grew progressively more remote. Emma entertained herself with the sketchbook Tom had given her, drawing pictures of pine trees and asking excited questions about wildlife. Richard regaled us with stories about the pristine wilderness area we were heading to, a place so remote it was accessible only by a private logging road his construction company maintained. "No cell towers, no other campers," he said, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. "Just us and nature." The complete isolation should have terrified me. Instead, watching Emma's excitement, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Mom died: hope for a real family connection. We reached the campsite as the sun was beginning to set behind the peaks. The location was breathtaking, a small clearing beside a crystal-clear lake, surrounded by towering pines and dramatic cliff faces. Richard and Tom had clearly been here before. They moved with practiced efficiency, setting up 3 tents and organizing cooking supplies while Sarah gathered firewood. "This place is incredible," I told Richard as we worked together to establish a fire ring. "How did you find it?" "Your mother and I came here once, early in our marriage," he replied, his voice taking on a wistful tone. "She said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen." The mention of Mom sent a familiar stab of grief through my chest, but also something else, a connection to her memory that I hadn't felt in months. Maybe this trip really was about healing family relationships. That first evening passed peacefully. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, told stories, and watched Emma's face glow in the firelight as she listened to Tom's tales about mountain wildlife. When she finally fell asleep in our tent, exhausted from the day's excitement, I joined the adults around the dying fire for adult conversation. "Claire," Richard began, his voice taking on a business-like tone, "I think we should talk about the company." "Richard," Sarah interrupted sharply, "this isn't the time." "When is the time?" he asked, his earlier warmth beginning to fade. "Claire's been avoiding my calls for months. She's threatening to dissolve a business your mother and I built together." "It's not a threat," I said quietly. "I'm planning to sell my shares and use the money to start fresh somewhere else. Emma and I need a new beginning." "Somewhere else?" Tom leaned forward, his friendly demeanor shifting slightly. "Where would you go?" "Oregon. I have a job offer in Portland, and Emma could use a change of scenery after everything she's been through." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. In the flickering firelight, their faces looked different, harder, more calculating. "That would be unfortunate," Richard said finally. "Your mother wouldn't have wanted you to abandon her legacy." "My mother left me that legacy to do with as I chose," I replied, standing up. "I think I'll turn in now. Long day tomorrow." As I walked toward my tent, I heard them murmuring in low voices behind me, but I was too tired to care about whatever family politics they were discussing. Emma was already fast asleep in her sleeping bag, clutching the stuffed elephant that had been her constant companion since her grandmother's death. I should have stayed awake. I should have listened to what they were saying. I should have trusted the cold dread that settled in my stomach as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to silence. Not the peaceful silence of wilderness morning, but the wrong kind of silence. No crackling of a rekindled fire, no murmur of voices preparing breakfast, no sound of movement from the other tents. Sitting up in my sleeping bag, I checked my watch. 7:30 a.m. Everyone else were early risers. They should have been up for hours. "Emma," I whispered, gently shaking my daughter's shoulder. "Wake up, sweetheart." She stirred groggily, rubbing her eyes. "Is it time for breakfast?" "Let's see what everyone else is doing," I said, unzipping the tent flap. The campsite was empty. Not just empty, completely stripped. The other 2 tents were gone. The fire ring had been dismantled and scattered. The cooking equipment, the coolers, the camp chairs. Everything had vanished as if our family had never been there at all. "Mommy, where is everyone?" Emma asked, crawling out of the tent beside me. My throat constricted as I ran to where the cars had been parked. Empty. Tire tracks in the dirt showed they'd left sometime during the night, taking both vehicles and leaving us stranded in a wilderness area with no cell service and no way to call for help. "Maybe they went to get supplies," Emma suggested hopefully, but her voice was small and uncertain. I was about to reassure her when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. On the picnic table, weighted down with a rock, was a manila envelope with my name written on it in Richard's precise handwriting. Inside were 3 documents that revealed the true scope of their plan. First, a forged suicide note in my handwriting, apparently copied from sample documents in Mom's files, explaining how grief over my mother's death had become unbearable, and how I'd decided to end both my life and Emma's in the wilderness where Mom had been happiest. Second, a life insurance policy I'd never seen before, taken out in my name 6 months ago with Emma and me as the insured parties, and Richard as the beneficiary. $2 million, payable even in cases of suicide after the standard 1-year waiting period. Third, a fake will, supposedly signed by me, leaving everything to Richard in case of my untimely death, and apologizing for the burden I've placed on my family. At the bottom of the envelope was a handwritten note in Richard's distinctive script. "I'm sorry it came to this, Claire. You should have been more reasonable about the business. Don't worry, Emma won't suffer long. The forest will take care of everything, and your mother's legacy will be preserved. Think of this as your final contribution to the family." I read the note 3 times before the full horror of it sank in. This wasn't abandonment or a cruel lesson. This was premeditated murder. They'd planned to leave us here to die of exposure, dehydration, or predation, then return days later to discover our bodies and claim we'd committed a murder-suicide. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Emma asked, noticing my hands shaking as I clutched the papers. "Nothing, baby," I managed, forcing my voice to remain calm. "We're going to have an adventure today, just you and me." I quickly inventoried our supplies, our tent, sleeping bags, a backpack with some snacks and 2 water bottles, the clothes on our backs, and the small camping kit I'd brought for Emma, a child's compass, a whistle, and a tiny LED flashlight. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As I forced myself to think clearly about our situation, I realized Richard had made several critical mistakes. First, he'd underestimated my determination to protect my daughter. Second, he'd forgotten that I'd grown up camping in these mountains with my mother before she married him. I knew these forests better than he thought. And third, most crucially, he had no idea that Mom had told me about the hidden cabin. When I was 12, Mom had shown me a hunting cabin about 6 miles northeast of this lake, built by her first husband, Emma's grandfather, who died when I was 15. It was officially abandoned, but Mom had maintained it secretly for years as a retreat. She'd made me promise never to tell Richard about it, saying it was our special place. If the cabin was still there, if it was still stocked with the emergency supplies Mom used to keep there, we might have a chance. "Emma," I said, kneeling down to her level, "we're going to play a game, a survival game, like those shows we watch on TV. But this is really important. You have to do exactly what I say, when I say it, okay?" She nodded seriously, picking up on the gravity in my voice despite my efforts to keep things light. "Good girl. First rule, we travel light and fast. We're only taking the most important things." I repacked our backpack with surgical precision. The remaining water, the snacks, Emma's compass and whistle, the flashlight, a knife from our eating utensils, and the stuffed elephant Emma refused to leave behind. "Second rule," I continued, "we follow the stream northeast. Water always leads somewhere, and if we get lost, we can follow it back." Emma nodded again, clutching her elephant tightly. "Third rule, if something happens to me, if we get separated or if I get hurt, you blow that whistle 3 times. Wait, then blow it 3 times again. Keep doing that until someone finds you." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Emma said fiercely. "Of course not," I agreed, forcing a smile. "But survival games have rules, right?" We set off through the forest, following the stream that fed into the lake. The terrain was challenging. Steep inclines, dense undergrowth, and loose rock that made footing treacherous. But I knew these mountains, and more importantly, I remembered the way to the cabin. What I didn't anticipate was that we weren't alone in the wilderness. 3 hours into our hike, as we stopped beside the stream to rest and refill our water bottles, Emma suddenly grabbed my arm. "Mommy," she whispered, "someone's following us." I froze, listening. At first I heard nothing but the babble of the stream and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then, faintly, the sound of boots on loose rock, maybe 50 yards behind us. My blood ran cold. Richard and his family had returned, not to rescue us, but to make sure we never made it out of the forest alive. "Quietly," I whispered to Emma, "we're going to hide." We scrambled off the trail and behind a fallen log, pressing ourselves flat against the forest floor. Through the gaps in the deadfall, I watched as a figure in dark clothing moved carefully along the stream, clearly tracking our path. But it wasn't Richard or Tom or Sarah. It was a woman I'd never seen before, dressed in military-style clothing and carrying professional tracking equipment. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who spent time hunting things, or people, in the wilderness. As she passed our hiding spot, I caught a glimpse of her face. Mid-30s, sharp features, and eyes that scanned the forest with predatory intensity. This wasn't some random hiker. This was someone who'd been sent to find us. But by whom and why? After she'd moved on, we waited 10 agonizing minutes before emerging from our hiding spot. My mind raced with possibilities. Had Richard hired a professional tracker to ensure we never made it out? Were there others hunting us through these woods? Who was that lady? Emma whispered. I don't know, baby, but we need to be extra careful now. Can you be really quiet as we walk? Emma nodded and we continued our trek through the forest, now hyper-aware that we were being hunted. The terrain grew more challenging as we climbed higher into the mountains. What had started as a gradual incline beside the stream became a steep scramble over rocky outcroppings and through dense stands of aspen and pine. Emma's 8-year-old legs were struggling, but she pushed forward without complaint, understanding instinctively that our lives depended on reaching safety. By mid-afternoon, we'd covered nearly 4 miles, but Emma was beginning to flag. Her small legs simply weren't designed for this kind of mountain hiking, and despite her brave face, I could see exhaustion beginning to take hold. I need to rest, Mommy, she said finally, sitting down heavily on a boulder beside the stream. Of course, sweetheart, you're doing amazing. As Emma drank water and nibbled on granola bar, I studied our surroundings. We were in a narrow valley now, with steep cliff faces rising on both sides. The stream had carved a winding path through the rock over millennia, creating a natural corridor through the mountains. And somewhere ahead, if my childhood memories were correct, was the hidden trail that led to Mom's secret cabin. Emma, I said, pulling out the child's compass she'd been carrying. Do you remember how to use this? She nodded seriously. The red arrow always points north. That's right. And if we need to split up for any reason, what direction do you go? Northeast, she recited. Follow the stream northeast until I find people or a road. Perfect. You're the best survival partner I've ever had. Emma beamed at the praise, and I felt a surge of fierce pride in my daughter's courage. She was handling this nightmare with more grace than most adults would have managed. We were about to resume hiking when I heard something that made my heart stop, the distant sound of an engine. In this remote wilderness, there should have been no motorized vehicles. The logging road Richard had used to reach the campsite was miles away, and there were no other access routes that I knew of, unless someone was using ATVs to track us through the forest. We need to move, I said urgently, helping Emma to her feet. Right now. The engine sound was getting closer, echoing off the cliff walls in a way that made it impossible to determine exactly where it was coming from. But one thing was clear. Whoever was driving was following the stream valley, the same route we'd been taking. We scrambled up the rocky bank, away from the stream and toward what I hoped was the hidden trail to the cabin. The sound of the engine grew louder, accompanied now by voices, at least 2 people, maybe more. There, one of them shouted. Fresh tracks by the water. I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her into a dense thicket of mountain laurel, just as an ATV rounded the bend below us. The rider was the same woman who'd been tracking us earlier, but now she had a companion. A man in tactical gear, carrying what looked like a high-powered rifle. They can't have gone far, the woman called over the engine noise. The kid was slowing them down. Richards is getting impatient, the man replied. He wants this finished today. It'll be finished, the woman said coldly, one way or another. They continued up the valley, the ATV's engine echoing off the rocks as they searched for our trail. I waited until the sound faded completely before allowing myself to breathe normally again. "Mommy," Emma whispered, "are those bad people?" "Yes, baby, very bad people. But we're smarter than them, okay? We know these woods better than they do." I hoped that was true, because now I understood the full scope of what we were facing. Richard hadn't just abandoned us to die of exposure. He'd hired professional killers to hunt us down and make sure we never left this wilderness alive. The hidden trail was exactly where I remembered it, concealed behind a stand of pine trees, and marked only by an old blaze carved into the bark decades ago. Mom had brought me here 3 times as a child, teaching me to recognize the subtle signs that mark the path. "This way," I whispered to Emma, leading her up the nearly invisible trail that switchbacked through the trees toward the ridge above. The climb was brutal. What had seemed like a moderate hike when I was 12 felt like mountaineering with an 8-year-old in tow. Emma's breathing became labored, and I had to carry her for stretches when the trail became too steep for her small legs. But we made it. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, we finally crested the ridge and saw it. Mom's secret cabin, exactly as I remembered it from 15 years ago. The structure was small and weathered, but still sound. A one-room hunting lodge built from local timber and stone. More importantly, it was completely hidden from view, nestled among the trees with no visible trail leading to it unless you knew exactly where to look. "Is this where we're staying tonight?" Emma asked as we approached the cabin. "For tonight and maybe longer," I replied, trying the door. It was locked, but I remembered Mom showing me where she hid the key, inside a fake rock beside the woodpile. The interior of the cabin was like stepping back in time. Everything was exactly as Mom had left it during her last visit. A stone fireplace, 2 simple beds, a small kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, and most importantly, shelves lined with emergency supplies. Canned food, bottled water, medical supplies, warm clothing, and, critically, a battery-powered radio. "Mommy, there's food here," Emma exclaimed, discovering the pantry shelves. "Your grandmother prepared this place for emergencies," I explained, opening a can of soup for dinner. She was always thinking ahead. As Emma ate, I checked the radio. The battery was dead, but I found a manual crank that could generate power. After several minutes of cranking, the radio crackled to life, and I began scanning for emergency frequencies. What I heard made my blood freeze. Search continues for Claire Morrison and her 8-year-old daughter Emma, who disappeared while camping in the Copper Ridge Wilderness area. The family is asking for volunteer search teams to assist in the rescue effort. Richard's voice came next, speaking to what sounded like a news reporter. "We're devastated by their disappearance. Claire has been struggling with depression since her mother's death, and we're deeply concerned for both her safety and young Emma's welfare. If anyone has information about their whereabouts, please contact authorities immediately." The bastard was playing the grieving family member, launching a public search effort that would provide perfect cover for his hunting party. While volunteers searched the obvious areas, his professional killers could hunt us through the remote wilderness without anyone asking questions. But he'd made another mistake. By reporting us missing so quickly, he'd started a timeline that worked in our favor. If we could survive long enough, if we could find a way to get word to real authorities, we might be able to expose his plot before he could claim we'd died in a tragic accident. "Emma," I said, turning off the radio to preserve battery, "we're going to stay here for a few days while some friends help us get home safely." "What kind of friends?" she asked. "The kind who don't let bad people hurt little girls and their mommies." That night, I lay awake listening to the forest sounds outside the cabin, planning our next move. We had food, water, and shelter for at least a week. The radio could reach emergency frequencies if we could get to higher ground. And somewhere out there, real search and rescue teams were looking for us. But we also had professional killers tracking us through the wilderness, and Richard had the resources to keep them hunting indefinitely. The next morning, everything changed. I woke to the sound of helicopters. Through the cabin's small window, I could see 3 aircraft circling the valley below. 2 that looked like rescue helicopters, and 1 that was definitely military or law enforcement. The cavalry had arrived, but were they friend or foe? "Mommy, are those the good guys?" Emma asked, pressing her face to the window. "I hope so, baby, but we need to be very careful about how we contact them." I cranked the radio again and tuned to the emergency frequency. The airwaves were busy with search and rescue communications, multiple teams coordinating a systematic search of the wilderness area. Grid 7 clear, moving to Grid 8. Ground team reports fresh tracks near the old mining road. Be advised, we have family members on ATVs in the area. Please coordinate to avoid interference. Family members on ATVs. Richard's killers were operating right alongside the legitimate search teams. I keyed the radio microphone, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Emergency, emergency. This is Claire Morrison. Emma and I are safe, but we need immediate police protection. We did not disappear voluntarily. We were abandoned by our family, and there are armed individuals hunting us in the forest. Please respond." Silence on the radio for several long seconds, then, "Claire Morrison, this is Alpine County Sheriff's Department. Can you confirm your location?" "Negative on exact location, but we're in the Copper Ridge area, approximately 6 miles northeast of Sunset Lake. We need immediate extraction and police protection. Our family members are attempting to harm us." "Understood. Are you or your daughter injured?" "No injuries, but we have limited supplies and there are armed individuals tracking us. Please send help immediately." "Roger that. We're dispatching teams to your approximate location. Stay on this frequency and we'll triangulate your position." I felt a surge of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. Real law enforcement was involved now, and they were taking our situation seriously. But my relief was short-lived. 20 minutes later, as Emma and I waited in the cabin for rescue, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the trail outside. Through the window, I saw him, Richard, dressed in expensive hiking gear and carrying a GPS unit, approaching the cabin with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Behind him came the woman tracker and her armed companion, along with 2 other men I didn't recognize. All of them were carrying weapons. My heart sank as I realized the horrible truth. Richard had known about the cabin all along. Mom hadn't kept it secret from him. She'd shared it with her husband, trusting him with one more piece of her life that he could use against her daughter. "Emma," I whispered urgently, "we need to leave, right now, back door." But as we crept toward the cabin's rear exit, I heard Richard's voice calling out cheerfully, "Claire! Emma, I know you're in there. Come out and let's talk about this like adults." The back door was blocked. 2 more men in tactical gear stood between us and the forest, weapons drawn and ready. We were trapped. "Claire, I'm disappointed in you," Richard continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I remembered from childhood. "Making up stories about being hunted, calling the sheriff with wild accusations. You're obviously having some kind of breakdown." Through the front window, I could see him approaching the door, flanked by his hired killers. "I know this has been hard since your mother died," he called out. "But involving Emma in your fantasies isn't fair to her. Come out now and we can get you the help you need." I looked around the cabin desperately, searching for options. The windows were too small to climb through. The back door was blocked. The only other exit was the cellar. Mom had shown me the hidden root cellar during one of our visits, accessed through a trapdoor concealed beneath a rug in the corner. It led to an underground storage area that connected to a natural cave system carved by underground streams. "Emma," I whispered, pulling up the rug to reveal the wooden trapdoor. "Down here, quickly." As we descended into the darkness below the cabin, I heard Richard trying the front door, then cursing when he found it locked. "Break it down," he ordered his men. The cellar was exactly as I remembered. a small underground room carved from the living rock, with shelves of preserved food and emergency supplies. But more importantly, there was another opening at the back, leading deeper into the mountain through a natural cave system. "Where are we going, Mommy?" Emma whispered as I led her into the caves, using her small LED flashlight to navigate. "To safety, baby. Your grandmother showed me these caves when I was little. They come out on the other side of the mountain." What I didn't tell her was that I'd only been through the caves once, 15 years ago, and I wasn't entirely sure I remembered the way. Behind us, I could hear Richard's men breaking down the cabin door, shouting when they discovered we weren't inside. "Check the cellar," Richard's voice echoed down from above. We moved deeper into the cave system, Emma's small flashlight our only source of light in the Stygian darkness. The passages were narrow and winding, carved by millennia of water flow through the limestone. Some chambers were large enough to stand upright in. Others required us to crawl on hands and knees through tight spaces that made me claustrophobic. "I hear them behind us," Emma whispered after we'd been walking for what felt like hours. She was right. The sound of voices and footsteps echoed through the cave system, distorted by the acoustics but definitely getting closer. Richard's team had flashlights and professional tracking equipment, and they were gaining on us. "This way," I said, choosing a passage that led steeply upward through the rock. My childhood memory suggested this route led to an exit near the summit of the ridge, but in the darkness and panic, I wasn't certain. The climb was brutal in the narrow confines of the cave. Emma's 8-year-old body was better suited to the tight spaces than mine, but she was tiring quickly, and the thin air at high altitude made breathing difficult. "Mommy, I can't go anymore," she gasped, sitting down heavily on a rocky ledge. "Yes, you can, baby. Just a little farther." But even as I encouraged her, I could hear our pursuers getting closer. Their voices echoed through the cave system, along with the beam of high-powered flashlights sweeping through the passages. That's when I made a decision that nearly killed us both. Instead of continuing up through the caves, I led Emma into a side passage that I thought might connect to another exit. But after 20 minutes of crawling through increasingly narrow spaces, we reached a dead end, a chamber barely large enough for both of us to sit, with no way forward and no way back without retracing our path directly into Richard's team. We were trapped underground in total darkness, with killers closing in from behind. "Mommy, I'm scared," Emma whispered, pressing against me in the confined space. "I know, baby. But remember what we learned about survival? Sometimes you have to wait, be very quiet, and let the bad guys go past you." It was a desperate hope, but it was all we had. We turned off the flashlight and sat in absolute darkness, listening to the sound of our own breathing and the distant voices of our hunters. The voices got closer and closer, until finally I could hear Richard himself, just outside our hiding place. "They came this way," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the cave acoustics. "The tracks are fresh." "Dead end ahead," one of his men reported. "They must have turned back." "No," Richard replied thoughtfully. "Claire's smarter than that. She wouldn't trap herself unless she had another way out." A beam of light swept across the entrance to our hiding spot. I pressed Emma against the back wall of the chamber, praying we were deep enough in the shadows to remain invisible. "Check every side passage," Richard ordered. "Every crack, every crevice. They're here somewhere." We sat in terrified silence as his team systematically searched the cave system around us. Twice, flashlight beams penetrated our hiding spot, and twice we somehow remained undetected in the deepest shadows. After what felt like hours, the voices finally began to recede. "Sir, they're not here," one of the men reported. "We've checked everything." "Impossible," Richard replied, but his voice was growing fainter. "They didn't double back past us." "Maybe they found another way out," the woman tracker suggested. "These old cave systems can have multiple exits." "Keep searching," Richard ordered. "They're here somewhere." But gradually, the voices faded until we could no longer hear them at all. We waited another hour in absolute silence before I dared to turn on the flashlight again. "Are they gone?" Emma whispered. "I think so, but we need to get out of here." The problem was, we still had no idea how to reach an exit, and going back the way we'd come would mean risking another encounter with Richard's team. That's when Emma made a discovery that saved our lives. "Mommy," she said, pointing to the far corner of our hiding chamber, "there's air moving over here." She was right. In the deepest corner of the dead-end chamber, there was a crack in the rock barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through. And from that crack came the faintest breath of fresh air. "You're brilliant, baby," I whispered, examining the opening. "Absolutely brilliant." The crack was too narrow for me to fit through, but Emma's small body could just squeeze through the gap. And if there was air movement, it meant the crack connected to the outside world somehow. "I'm going to boost you up," I told her. "Squeeze through that crack and see where it goes. But be very careful, and if it's dangerous, come right back." Emma nodded seriously and allowed me to lift her up to the opening. She wriggled through the crack with the determination of a child who understood her life depended on it. For 5 agonizing minutes, I waited in the darkness, listening for any sound of her return. Then, faintly, I heard her voice echoing from somewhere above me. "Mommy, I can see sky!" The crack led to a natural chimney in the rock that opened onto the mountainside above. Emma had found our way out. Getting through that crack myself required removing my jacket and backpack, scraping skin from my shoulders and hips as I forced my adult body through an opening designed for someone Emma's size. But desperation gave me strength, and after several painful minutes, I emerged into daylight on a rocky ledge high above the forest. We were on the eastern face of the mountain, at least 1,000 feet above the valley where Richard's team was searching. The view was spectacular, rolling wilderness stretching to the horizon, with no sign of human habitation except for the distant glint of a highway far below. "Which way now, Mommy?" Emma asked. I checked her compass and studied the landscape. The highway was at least 10 miles away through rough terrain, but it was our best hope of reaching civilization and safety. "Down," I said simply. "We're going to walk out of these mountains, and when we get to that road, we're going to tell everyone who will listen exactly what your step-grandfather tried to do to us." The descent from the mountain took us 2 days. We had no food except for a few energy bars I'd grabbed from the cabin, no water except what we could find in mountain streams, and no shelter except what we could improvise from pine boughs and our own body heat. Emma's feet were blistered in her hiking boots, and my injured shoulders from squeezing through the rock crack made carrying our makeshift pack agonizing. But we kept moving, driven by the knowledge that Richard's team was still out there somewhere, still hunting us through the wilderness. On the second day, as we descended through lower elevations toward the valley floor, we heard helicopters again. But these sounded different, more systematic, more thorough. Real search and rescue teams, not Richard's hired killers. "Should we signal them?" Emma asked, watching a helicopter circle in the distance. "Not yet," I replied. "We need to be sure they're the good guys first." That afternoon, as we finally reached the tree line and could see the highway in the distance, we encountered our first other human beings since escaping the cave. 2 hikers, a middle-aged couple from Colorado Springs, found us sitting beside a mountain stream trying to treat Emma's blistered feet with cold water. "Oh my God," the woman exclaimed when she saw us. "Are you Claire Morrison? Everyone's been looking for you." "Yes," I replied cautiously, "but we need to be very careful about who we trust." The man, who introduced himself as Dr. James Wheeler, immediately began checking Emma for injuries while his wife called 911 on a satellite phone. "We're okay," I told him, "but we need to speak to law enforcement immediately. Real law enforcement, not anyone connected to our family." Dr. Wheeler nodded seriously. "There's been a massive search effort. The FBI got involved yesterday when someone reported suspicious radio communications in the area. The FBI? Your stepfather filed a missing persons report, but apparently someone called in a tip about insurance fraud and suspicious circumstances. They're treating this as a potential kidnapping case now. My heart leaped with hope. Someone had taken my radio call seriously enough to investigate Richard's background. 2 hours later, we were sitting in the back of an ambulance, being checked over by paramedics, while FBI agent Sarah Chen took our statement. Mrs. Morrison, Agent Chen said, we've been investigating your stepfather's finances since yesterday. The insurance policy, the forged documents, the suspicious timing of your disappearance, it all raised red flags. So you believe us? We believe you. In fact, we arrested Richard Morrison and his associates this morning when they returned to town claiming they'd found your bodies in the wilderness. What? Your stepfather told local authorities that he'd found evidence of a murder-suicide in a remote canyon. He claimed you'd killed your daughter and then yourself. He even had photographs of what he claimed were your remains. Agent Chen showed me pictures on her tablet, staged photos of torn clothing and fake blood, positioned to look like the aftermath of a tragic death. He was going to use these to close the case and claim the insurance money, she continued. But our investigation had already identified inconsistencies in his story. What happens now? Richard Morrison, Sarah Mitchell, Tom Mitchell, and 3 hired associates are all facing federal charges for attempted murder, fraud, and kidnapping. They're not going anywhere for a very long time. As we drove away from the mountains in the back of that ambulance, Emma asleep beside me and my stepfather finally in custody, I felt a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and rage. Richard had tried to murder us for money, but his greed had been his downfall. By moving too quickly, by involving too many people, by underestimating both my determination to protect Emma and the competence of federal investigators, he'd sealed his own fate. 6 months later, I testified at his trial. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the staged photographs, the testimony of his hired killers who'd turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah and Tom received 25 years each. The hired killers got 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder. The $2 million insurance policy was invalidated, and Richard's assets were seized to pay for his victims' therapy and medical expenses. But the most satisfying moment came during victim impact statements, when I stood before the court with Emma beside me and looked Richard directly in the eyes. You tried to kill us for money, I told him, my voice steady and clear. You tried to murder an 8-year-old child because you were too greedy to accept losing control of a business that was never really yours. But you failed. We survived. We escaped. We won. And now everyone knows exactly what kind of monster you really are. Richard's expression remained cold and calculating right up until the judge read his sentence. Only then did I see fear in his eyes, the realization that his manipulations and schemes had finally caught up with him. Emma and I moved to Oregon as originally planned, but not as refugees fleeing family trauma. We moved as survivors, stronger and more bonded than ever, ready to build a new life based on genuine love and trust, rather than the toxic manipulation we'd left behind. We still go camping together, Emma and I, but now we carry GPS beacons, satellite phones, and enough survival gear to handle any emergency. Emma has become quite the outdoors expert, and she often jokes that she's the only kid in her class who knows how to navigate by compass and start a fire with wet wood. Sometimes, when we're sitting around a campfire in the peaceful wilderness, Emma will ask about her step-grandfather and why he tried to hurt us. Some people, I tell her, let greed and power become more important than love. They forget that family is supposed to protect each other, not use each other. But we protected each other, Emma always replies. Yes, we did, and we always will. The wilderness taught us both valuable lessons about survival, but the most important lesson had nothing to do with finding water or building shelter or escaping through caves. It taught us that real family isn't about blood relations or legal documents or business inheritances. Real family is about people who would crawl through hell to protect each other, who would face down professional killers and traverse mountains and risk everything for each other's safety. Emma and I found that kind of family in each other during our darkest hours, and no amount of money, no insurance policy, no inheritance scheme could ever be worth more than that. Sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't bears or mountain lions. Sometimes they're the people who claim to love you most. But sometimes, if you're brave enough and smart enough and lucky enough, you can survive their hunt and turn the tables on them in ways they never saw coming. And when that happens, when justice finally prevails and the monsters are caged where they belong, the satisfaction is sweeter than any inheritance could ever be.